Okay, so as of this recording, it is mid-April of 2025, but I won't actually be releasing this recording until later in the year, probably, you know, certainly much closer to when VONATS happens. I did a special build for the Vintage Off-Road Nationals for the Classic class, and I'm trying to be a little sneaky with essentially trying to have a competitive edge. That's part of the fun of this whole thing. So I'm quite happy with what I did here. But again, I want to keep it a secret until later. So for those of you who don't know, the classic class at Vonats is quite straightforward. You get a Tamiya Sport Tuned motor. It's a silver can motor. It's a handout motor, and you have to run a plastic tub chassis that is sort of like not a racing chassis. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now you can take that and turn it into a racing chassis, more or less. So for example, this Tamiya Madcap, I have a lot of aftermarket parts on this. Basically as many astute or super astute parts to increase its raceworthiness. And I brought this to Vonets last year to try it out. And I was kind of hoping that it would be competitive against the four-wheel drive cars that are also racing in that class, namely the DF01 chassis, like my Dirt Thrasher or other people with their Manta Rays. And at the time I was running this gearbox right here. This is the Astute gearbox, or the Madcap gearbox that goes right in. And I made some modifications, like, this aluminum lower cover here. There's a Delrin gear diff in here for durability. And I ran a Charisma style pinion gear, which has an integrated slipper clutch to try to save the spur gear. And that was all fine and good. And this thing actually has pretty low rotational resistance for the gearbox, so it was okay. But it has a fair amount of mass, and also the pinion itself that I was using is kind of heavy, and I want to minimize rotational mass on the motor because it's a limited power output motor. And also wanted more gearing options. This only gives you one spur gear you can run. So for this, I put in a Lethal Weapon gearbox. I think I went over this before, and I'll bring this to Vonats and I'll try it out. Maybe this will help a little bit because this allows me with the power clutch to run 48 pitch spur gear, so I can run any spur gear I like as long as it's a Robinson or Kimbrough style, and a really lightweight pinion gear. So maybe this will be a little punchier. But I'm not sure that this alone will be enough to really be quite as fast as a four-wheel drive buggy. And to do a fair comparison between the two, you kind of want to use the same gearbox, because the gearbox on this isn't exactly what you would have in a DF01. That's a different gearbox. And so the internal resistance you have in that gearbox is a little different. And one of the arguments for two-wheel drive over four-wheel drive is that two-wheel drive should be faster because there's less drag. You're driving fewer internal components. The problem is you don't get as much punch coming out of corners because four-wheel drive, you're putting power to all four wheels. So on balance, four-wheel drive is always faster. So I want to change that. Or I want to see if I could build something that two-wheel drive buggy that might be competitive against a four-wheel drive buggy. So that got me to this guy right here. So this is a mid-motor Tamiya Madcap. Okay, so back in the early 90s, Jamie Booth made a mid-motor variant of, it was either the Astute or the Super Astute, and what he basically did was he hacked up the rear a little bit so that he can mount a Top Force or TAO2 rear gearbox with Top Force suspension to the back. And that's basically, that gives you like a 3-gear mid-motor arrangement. So I figured, okay, well, the Madcap is basically a plastic version of the Astute. So if you have a Dremel and you do enough cutting and hacking, you could make it fit. So that's what this is. And I'll walk you a little bit through just the overall build, and I'll go into some detail on the rear as well. So let's start at the front here. Okay, and let me just take these body clips off. Hold on a second, I'm doing this with one hand. By the way, you'll note that even though this is a mid-motor layout, the body here is just the standard body for the Madcap. I didn't do any special custom cutting or anything like that to make it fit. You do have to play some games with how you mount it, but I'll get to that later. And by the way, the paint scheme for this, or the paint job on this, this came with the car when I got it. Someone else did this paint and put these nice decals on. I only added the prototype sticker and some XP1 stickers to give it a bit more like Space C kind of prototype feel. because this really is a prototype car. It's one of a kind. So yeah, okay. Anyway, take the body off. So at the front here, this is actually very similar to what I've done on that Madcap right there, where I have an aluminum front bulkhead. This particular one is from, was it Extra Speed? And the one on that is from Pargu, but they're very, very similar. And you do have to, let me get a screwdriver or something here. You do have to cut it out in this section here, because there's these two plastic posts that come up from the chassis, and those are part of the chassis mold. So to make this bulkhead fit around that, you just have to cut the material out, okay? And then these two posts normally house this, let me see if I can find the part here. It's like a cap. Hold on, let me get, is it here? Yeah. It's this part right here that would normally go over like that. But when you convert the front end to a like super astute style front end, the cap doesn't fit, especially with this post here that I'm using. I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, super astute aluminum front bulkhead, super astute bumper, right? The Madcap bumper is a bit fatter and wider. I just wanted something a bit more lightweight, a bit more tight looking, so I got the super astute bumper. Thankfully, the Super Suit is a re-release car, so I can actually get this now. On that one, when I built that, it was before the Super Suit got re-released, so I needed a 3D printed bumper anyway. So that's on there. We have these Extra Speed aluminum steering bell crank for the Super Astute. Same thing I have in the other one. And the key with this is this steering rack ends up mounting higher than the stock steering rack that would go onto this chassis. And as a result of that, the body, if you cut it normally, it won't clear the rack when you're steering lock to lock. So what I did is I used a taller body mount up front to lift the nose a little bit, and that'll lift the nose so that especially on this side, this arm will clear the body without me having to cut out extra material. That body mount actually comes from over here. Okay, so I'll just go over that right now, where normally on this side here, this part of the chassis has a little hole in it, and you mount this body mount in, and there's some holes to mount the height of it. Okay, fine. There's another one of those that would normally be on that side. Now when I did the mid-motor conversion, I had to cut away that part of the chassis. So that means I had that body mount sort of for free use elsewhere. I put it up front here to push the nose higher, okay? And then over here, what I did is in this, on the side of the battery housing here, you have these two holes that would normally mount some kind of a, I'm not sure what you would call it, but basically like an enclosure to hold your stick pack in. You don't need that anymore because you can use an ultra shorty right here. So instead, I just found some other Tamiya parts, like a little spacer thing here with a long screw. This is a Manta Ray camber link, so I just cut it and then put one of these ball stud type screws in the middle here, and then you can just rotate it over. That way it actually mounts over the motor, but it doesn't actually touch the motor. As you can see, you get clearance, and then that is just the right location to fit this body with the stock mounting hole, because as you can see, there's not a whole lot of space there given the topography of the body to fit that mount in a different location. Okay, so that's how that works. High cap dampers, right? Same thing on the other car. For the front here, I did sort of the same thing with the caster blocks. These are actually Traxxas caster blocks, 30 degree for the, normally you use them for the TRX3. I use these because they're geometrically almost exactly the same as the Madcap ones, but these are stronger. And then for the spindle, these are super astute spindles, which have a longer arm on it. On this Madcap over here, I use the stock spindles, which have a shorter arm. So you get a different steering geometry. This should give you less Ackerman, I think, which maybe you'd want on a mid-motor car, which will already give you more aggressive steering. But really, like, I mounted it because I just had the parts, and I figured I'd just throw those on instead of the stock spindle carriers. But there might be some geometric advantage. I might play around with that later on to see which is better. But anyway, that's the front end. Essentially exactly the same as what I did for the other Madcap. If you're going to mount, by the way, a shorty pack in the middle here, it mounts transverse like this, you're going to need a low profile servo. Okay, if you have a standard servo, you won't be able to fit the battery here, and then you got to put it down here. So low profile servo, shorty, this ultra shorty just slots right in. It's actually a nice tight fit, but to make sure that it fits, you can get yet another manta ray camber link. Okay, and I just mount it on one of the holes here on this upper plate, and then I put a little, if I go around here, a little spacer on the bottom here so that this picks up the slack that would normally exist between this camber link and the top surface of the battery. So when I put this over, it actually touches the top of the battery, helps to hold it in place. You probably don't need this, strictly speaking. It's kind of a snug fit putting that ultra shorty in here, but this is just a little bit of extra assurance, okay? Going further back, I know my electronics and wiring is usually a bit of a mess. It's more that the wiring's a mess. I don't like to cut wires to like save space and make it look clean. So I just use twisty ties wherever I can to try to make things a little clean. But anyway, try to ignore that. In terms of the electronics mounting, the receiver is actually in there. And so all the wires, like for the fan and the speed control, they come in through this way, and I got this foam cover here, and it just covers that whole fat mess that goes into that receiver, and the receiver mounts in here. That allows me to put the speed control up here, where you get a little bit more air, right? I mean, this, when it mounts, it is going to cover the speed control, but you get some air from the backside here, so maybe a little bit of airflow. This particular speed control is a Tekin G12C 3. This is one of their higher end speed controls from the 90s. Normally I use a Novak Tempest, which is one of my favorite vintage speed controls. I got one right here. This thing is awesome. It has really strong brakes, very reliable. I have a couple of these, and they're just a really great speed control. But for this, frankly, I just wanted something that would match the color scheme. This is a black and silver and white kind of a look. So I figured this would go better color-wise with the chassis. I know that's kind of a vain reason to use it, but there's also an extremely good speed control. And one thing that's kind of neat about it is it has this, in addition to the maximum current setting that also the Tempest has, there's this additional knob here, or it's like a potentiometer to adjust, I think, the initial brake strength. So if you dial that down, that'll make the brakes a little bit smoother when you start to apply the brakes, which on a mid-motor car, if you're on a looser surface, that could be very useful. So that's another reason why I wanted to run this. Now, as for this whole mess, this is the fun part. So, okay, long story short, you got to cut stuff. And essentially, you need to cut material from the bottom and from sort of where the bulkhead would normally mount out this way, and then also some material around the battery housing here so the motor can slot in nice and clean. That also means there's like ridge type material at the bottom of the chassis. You got to try to flatten that out as well so this isn't sort of stuck on that and mounting at a weird angle. So you have to do all that. It's just like a trial and error process of cutting and, you know, checking out, does the gearbox fit or not. But what you generally want to do is set it up so that for the Top Force gearbox, it's actually a really convenient gearbox to use. The bottom two mounting holes for that gearbox are right here. And those are actually, in terms of their spacing, perfectly aligned to holes that already exist on this Madcap gearbox. And then this little bottom bit here where the diff is in the Top Force gearbox, that also fits nicely in this hole. It doesn't fill up the whole space, right, because it's not made for the chassis, but the alignment's pretty nice. So if you set it up so that the gearbox lines up in like so, then on top, the top two parts of the gearbox, here are these two holes. So you got, sorry, this is a mess. You have one hole here, another hole here. That's going to screw through this top plastic plate. Okay, now you do have to cut this top plate, and you have to be a little careful because you have to cut away enough material on this top plate on this side to fit the motor, and also on this side over here, because this gearbox protrudes out a little bit in the part where the motor mounts and the spur gear goes in. So you need to trim enough of this out to fit that, but you also need to leave some behind so that there's enough material to encompass the screws that you're going to put through these two holes here. Okay, and you have to, I think you got to drill holes for that, and through this plastic. And then just on the back side, I have an M3 lock nut to lock this top plate down to this gearbox. Okay, so getting in, you got to like put your finger in here and hold the lock nut there, and then screw this thing on, and you know, it's a bit of an operation, but it fits. So that's one piece there. The other thing is, when you do that, the chassis will still have a little bit of flex. So to reinforce the chassis a little bit more, I drilled 2 additional holes, one here and one here, through the chassis, through the top plate and straight down through the chassis, countersunk the bottom hole in the chassis, and I have these standoffs here, one on this side and one on the other side, and I just screw the screws into there. That makes your chassis nice and rigid. So there's very little flex this way on the chassis. This is actually pretty solid once you put it all together. Okay, so that's more or less how the gearbox fits. You do have to do a little bit of extra trimming around here, because you need to be able to have space to actually place this screw in. This screw is the top right screw to mount the motor. So you got that screw there, and then there's another screw here, and you can tell, like, you can kind of hit it with, this is a 2.5. Where's the 2mm? Oh, it's right here. Okay, so if I come in with the 2mm at an angle, right, I can reach that, and I could screw that in. Okay, this one here, I can't actually get the screw head in. Either I cut out more material, see, can't really do that, or what you can do is take like an L-shaped Allen key, and then, like if this were 2mm, for example, and you just cut the end, so that way you have something that could fit in there, and you just go in a little bit at a time and you screw it in. Now the other thing is, you either do that, or you have to like rip this whole thing apart and mount the motor first and mount everything and put it all together. Pain in the butt. The other thing is, you can't fit a 3x10 screw in here. Normally you have to put a 3x10 screw into these 2 holes here to mount to the motor mount, or at least that's what the manual says for the Top Force and the DF01. But you don't need a 3x10. You can make this shorter. You can do like a 3x6. And that's what I have for this top screw here, because I really have to like take the 3x6 with some tweezers, put it in there, kind of place it in, and try to screw it in a little bit, and then get your L-shaped Allen key and just slowly kind of crank away at it, just to mount it. So mounting and dismounting the motor is a bit of a challenge. You can do it that way, or you can, like, again, sort of take apart the upper plate to give yourself more clearance to get in there. Either way, it's a bit of a challenge. But once it fits fine. So let's see, if we go back around, because now that we're talking about the motor, other thing with the screws, right? Before I get to this side, is these 3 screws here that you use to mount the top gearbox cover onto this gearbox. This is, again, normally you would use a 3x10 screw. This is just a tip for anybody running this gearbox on a Top Force or DF01 or whatever. Generally, you'll have cracking on these mounting points, especially on the bottom portion of the gearbox here. And some of that is because the screw is putting stress on the plastic. And what I was realizing so many years later, I've gone through so many of these gearboxes over the years, is that the 3x10, as you screw it in and you're starting to thread the plastic, it gets harder as you're screwing it in. So you can play games like making the screw hot, so you screw it in and kind of melts the plastic a little bit, makes it easier, or you can just use a shorter screw. You don't need to use a 3x10. You can use a 3x8 or a 3x6, and that'll put less stress on the plastic, on the bottom side here, and it'll last longer and not crack, or at least that's what I hope will happen. Okay, so you do that, you should be all set. And now going back to the other side, I'll go back over here. You notice here I have a fan with a Lexan guard, and the point there is to direct air into the motor. So how is this set up? On the top of the Top Force gearbox, normally there's something you would mount here. I can't remember. I think this is for the antenna. You used to be able to, there's like a little plastic piece you put here, and I think that would be an antenna mount. There's 3 holes. one hole for the screw here, and these 2 holes here for like two little pegs in that plastic piece. I just took the hole all the way up to this side and bored it out to fit an M3 screw, because this piece here is just a upper camber link for a TA02, and it's just the right length and just the right shape and everything where I could screw it in here and then have another screw from the back side of the fan to mount the fan to this side here. Okay, and I just rotate it over and line this whole thing up. And then this part here is a piece of Lexan that I mount to the fan, and I bend it so that when the air pushes down, it's going to hit the fan and then go this way. And what's convenient is the way this motor mounts to the gearbox, one of the openings to the can is right here. So this is just going to blow air straight down and into the can right here. And then it'll come out this side, okay, where it's pretty open space. I mean, there's a receiver there, but by and large, this is open space. So this should be really good for cooling. And especially because you have this body post here, there's not really space to mount a heatsink. And even if you could mount one, it would have to be a pretty narrow heatsink. It wouldn't be able to run all the way out to the end. And if you did that, also you end up covering up this hole. So you got to be a little careful mounting a heatsink here. So I figure a fan would be more than adequate. Okay, so that's the fan piece. Now getting to the other thing. With this gearbox, you'll notice here, these aluminum bits, those are the same kind of part that I use again on that Madcap. Just like with the front bulkhead, you can get these from either Extra Speed or Pargu. Very similar part, same geometry, they take bearings and everything. But to make this work, you have to cut away part of the gearbox, because the DF01 gearbox already has inner hinge pin mounts as part of that mold. So you have to cut those away. The thing is, if you try to make that fit onto the chassis with clearance for this part here, you have to cut away too much material on the gearbox. So you also have to cut away a little bit of material on this aluminum part here, because otherwise you'd end up cutting into the gearbox and exposing the gears, and you don't want that. So you got to do a little bit of balancing between how much material you cut away from the gearbox and how much material you cut away just from the very inner edge here, or the inner surface on these arm mounts, to make everything fit. But it does fit if you do it right, okay? So that covers that, and then I guess we'll get to the tower later. If we go out this way, these are your Madcap rear suspension arms. These are the rear hub carriers for the Super Astute that have these multiple mounting points here. They don't all work, right? You have to pick the right mounting point for the geometry of the car. So this universal here, that's from Extra Speed. This is for the Super Astute. And the length of that dog bone will require you to do multiple things. Number one, you have to use the upper inside hole on this rear hub carrier. So you don't really have much room to tune things here. You could use, I think, the lower inside hole as well. But the problem there is you don't have enough droop, and then you don't have enough suspension travel, and you're going to be slamming the bottom of the chassis. So you want more. If you want the droop, you have to use the upper hole and the inside hole. The outside hole it pushes things too far in, and the dog bone will hit the inside of the diff out drive. Even with this hole here, the dog bone's still too long, but there's a trick you can play inside the hub carrier. Normally you mount a 5x11 bearing on the outside and the inside, but there's in the molding, there's like a spacer between the two bearings, and the diameter of that spacer is, I think, 8 millimeters. So you can get a 5x8 bearing, I think a flanged bearing, and you put that there. So you take the 5x11 bearing out of the inside, and you replace it with a 5x8 flange bearing to mount into that spacing. So you got two bearings that are now closer together, and then you mount this through, and you put some spacers here, right here, you see that, to pick up the extra slack. So it's going to push this whole thing out. That's okay, but that allows the dog bone to have clearance on the diff out drive with full suspension compression. It's not going to hit the inside of the out drive, okay? And then here I just have like a 5x8 metal bushing, and then some axle shims just to take up the rest of the slack. And I just mount this wheel hex here, and everything's all good. And it just so happens, by the way, when you do it this way, and you put on the wheels that I'm using, you get the perfect width. So you don't have this like wonky sort of offset between the front and rear width. It actually works quite nicely. High cap shocks in the rear, very clearly. Even with these, and with this setup here, you still need a longer shock end to get enough droop, okay? And that has to do with the type of tower I'm using. I'll get to that in a minute. But make sure if you're going to do this, that to pay attention to droop on the back, because if you don't have enough droop and the shock's in the wrong position, you won't have enough suspension travel and you're just going to be bottoming out all the time, okay? So this is just a longer rod end here, and use a couple screws, have a couple nuts here to offset the shock mounting position so I get a more straight angle going this way, so it's not at some wonky angle, and then that's all set. Now, for the rear tower, this is from EXO, right? I have another one here. So they make this really cool, like reinforced shock tower mounting set where you get a shock tower and this extra plate here. And the whole point here is normally the top force tower only for like a stock build. If I go here, it would just mount to this plastic piece here on the actual gearbox. And this can break if you put enough pressure on the top here, like if you flip the car over, for example. So all this part is doing, or this modification is doing, is it allows you to spread the load between those two mounting points, which is here and here, and these two mounting points for the rear gear cover. Okay, so you have 4 mounting points for the tower instead of just 2. It's a bit more complicated assembly, but it works really nicely. The only thing is you have to use this tower that comes with the kit. If you try to use the stock top force tower, I mean, you could probably cut holes to make it all fit, but the stock top force tower already has cutouts in it that would make it really difficult, maybe impossible, to get those holes in the right location to make it fit onto this. So you got to use this tower. Now this tower is geometrically a little bit different from the Top Force or Top Force Evo towers. These holes here for the shock mounting position, I think they would be equivalent to, or roughly equivalent to, the bottom holes on a Top Force Evo tower. So that's good. That would give you the most droop, which is what you need in this conversion. But these holes here for the inner camber link, those are also lower, which is good if you're on a higher grip track. So basically, the top 2 holes here would be, if you line it up with a Top Force tower, they'd be pretty close to the bottom hole on a stock Top Force tower. Okay, so if you care about roll center, just be aware of that. I'm kind of hopeful that with the geometry that I have here, that it'll be sufficient for the Vintage Nationals. But anyway, it's something to point out. So anyway, that's all mounted. Now I did have to do one small adjustment here, because one problem you're going to have, depending on how you want to do this, is clearance for the inner ball cup on the right-hand side of the chassis against the gearbox. So normally you might use something like this thing here as an end piece for this turnbuckle, in which case you're not really going to have a problem with clearance here, because the ball stud would come out to right about here. But with these ball cups, they wrap around the ball stud and it takes up a little more space. But I really like these RPM ball cups. They're very strong and they're white, and it goes really nicely with like the color scheme, right? This is a bit of an art project as much as it is a design project. So to have clearance there, I have to push the tower back. So that way I have room to take this off if I need to adjust the position, and to take this ball stud out. Otherwise, it's going to run into this part of the rear gearbox and I can't even get it out. So what I did is I just added a 1mm spacer between, here it is, 1mm spacer, this guy right here, between the gearbox and the tower. This is just a Kyosho spacer. If you look at like a Kyosho RB6 or a ZX6, they have these little spacers you can put between, like the front bulkhead and the chassis, or the rear arm mount and the chassis, to adjust anti-squat or kick up or anything like this. So you just take one of those and drill holes where you need to just make it fit. And that pushes the whole thing back a little bit, and that gives you a little bit more clearance over here, okay? And it does help you line up the shock. I mean, I got, 3 screws here that pushes this back, but with this pushed back 1mm and these 3 screws here, or nuts rather, this lines up pretty nicely. If I didn't have that, this would be forward and the shock would be doing this. And then I have to take one of these nuts out and then the shock would kind of be doing this a little bit. So that's like a secondary effect, but the primary effect is having clearance here. Okay. The other thing I did, and this is like a minor thing, but also noteworthy, is see this O-ring here between, so I have that hole that I'm putting a screw through isn't a new hole. Sorry. That's just this hole right here. Okay, so I didn't, this hole comes with the chassis. And it just so happens that it lines up with this little plastic piece here that extends out from this rear gear cover. Normally on a top force or a TA02, onto these holes you would mount the rear bumper, okay? But the rear bumper for the Madcap, or actually this is a Super Astute rear bumper, which fits perfectly onto the Madcap chassis. It mounts onto the chassis itself, not the rear gear cover. And so there would otherwise be this gap between the gear cover and the chassis, and you could have some flex there in the chassis that could smack into that rear gear cover. And if you're racing hard, I just don't want to take any risk of any sort of force that would be applied through this gap hitting the rear gear cover and causing it to crack. So I drilled a hole from the back through a portion of this. I mean, you can kind of see the screw sticking out a little bit here. It just goes up through this part here. It's a 3x10 screw. I just take a little O-ring here just to fill out the gap between the rear gear cover and the chassis, put a screw through. So that's like another screw that helps to secure the gearbox to the chassis and also pick up the gap between the gearbox and the chassis on the back. See, so if the chassis flexes up a little bit, that O-ring is going to sort of pick up that extra, you know, it's going to absorb the impact. Okay, so this is what I actually plan to run in the Classic class in the Vintage Off-Road Nationals this year. And what's interesting to me is a few things. First, it uses the same rear gearbox as the DF01. So that's as much of an apples-to-apples comparison as you can hope for, comparing the best four-wheel drive chassis you can run in that class versus an equivalent, let's say, two-wheel drive chassis. So you don't have any difference in the types of gears or the internal resistance of the gearbox or anything like that. Exact same gearbox. You just have fewer of, you have half of them. You're not driving a front gearbox. Okay, you don't even need this gear here because you're not driving the front gearbox. So it's just the spur gear that goes to the input shaft, the idler gear, the diff gear. That's it. It's like a conventional two-wheel drive buggy gearbox. And I just put some electrical tape, by the way, over this opening here, just to keep dirt and dust out. Okay, hopefully that holds. If it doesn't, I just gotta clean it up and mount more. But you want to close up that little hole there to keep dirt out. So I think this will be faster in a straight line than the DF01 because same gearbox, same exact gear ratio, all of that. It's just half of the total transmission. So it should be less overall drag. It should actually be faster, provided there's enough grip. This will also corner better. I did test drive this a little bit around in the basement just to see how it corners. Oh my God, this thing corners very sharply. Hopefully not too sharply on the racetrack, we'll see. So that's really promising. So it's going to handle great. It should be very fast in a straight line, provided I have enough grip. So we'll see if I have enough grip to actually be competitive coming out of corners. Certainly going into corners, I'm going to make up a lot of time. It should jump very nicely because this mid-motor should be very neutral. Hopefully I have enough droop to accommodate, suspension travel, or the not bottoming out so much on the chassis. The only thing here that's a limitation compared to this Madcap is this one I have nearly infinite gear, well not infinite, but many more gearing options because the spur gear is a 48-pitch spur gear and I can do whatever I want there. On this, I'm stuck with the TA02